Monday, January 25th, 2021, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So in the last 10 months, it's been even more pronounced. All the Keynesian economic policy, all the intervention, all the big government, we are told, or we've been told since the 70s. Even Richard Nixon, who was supposed to be Republican free marketeer, once said we are all Keynesians now. And we are told that the government needs to intervene because the market and individuals, you can't trust them. This fiscal year in the UK, the deficit is going to be over 400 billion, which is more than 25% of GDP. And that's adding on to the debt. That's raising inequality. That's destroying prosperity of the economy, not only in the UK, but also in Europe, in the United States, all over the Western world. We're getting more inequality, more debt. The rich are getting richer. The middle class is being eviscerated. And you try to argue with people, and I have been trying to do that for 20 years now, that there is another way. It's the way of liberty, free market, laissez-faire, and small governments. And people say, oh, that's utopia. Well, today I'm going to give you a real example of post-World War II economic miracle based on laissez-faire economics and small government. And believe it or not, it's Hong Kong. And I bought a book recently called The Architect of Prosperity, Sir John Cowperthwaite and the Making of Hong Kong by Neil Monnery. Here you go. It's a great book, and I'm going to go over some of the stuff that I've read already. I'm halfway through the book, but I think we need to talk about this book today. Before that, let's quickly look at where the markets are this morning. It's 8:15 a.m. London. So we've got spot gold at 1852. It's down just over $3. Low has been 1849. The high 1860. Silver is up 4 cents at 25.53. Range has been 25.39 to 25.72. So precious metals are still not going anywhere, but pretty steady, I would say, this morning. The Dow future is up 76 points at 31,070. That's a 0.25% higher. S&P future is up almost 0.5% at 38.56. NASDAQ 100 future up 115 points, almost 1% at 13,478. The currencies, we got sterling up 1/8 at 137.00. The euro is unchanged, 121.75, and the dollar is unchanged as well versus the yen at 103.73. Dollar is down 0.2% versus the yuan at 648.60. Copper is up 0.2%. WTI crude is up 0.5% at 52.58. The 10-year yield is at 110. So it looks like the market, bond market, treasury market has been frozen right now around that level. We will keep an eye on it, of course. So yes, we are told, not just by the left, but the right as well. President Trump was annoyed that people didn't get their $2,000 check. From the government. It's not really from the government. It's taking from a part of society and giving it to the other part, because government doesn't create wealth. So in this day and age, people, all kinds of political parties or people are all Keynesians. Yes, I know a lot of you out there are for small government and free market Austrian economics, so to speak, laissez-faire. But the political class is still stuck in this idea that for some reason the government has to do something instead of letting individuals do something about the economy, because it's individuals and the private sector that create wealth. So today we're going to go through this book, The Architect of Prosperity. And reading this book, though, about John Cowperthwaite, you realize that it wasn't just him. His predecessors were making sure that Hong Kong became very wealthy and prosperous. So to give you a little background on Hong Kong up until, I guess, the post-war, early post-war period, so that's like after 45 to 1950, was known more as an entrepot. An entrepot is just like a port city. It says a port city or other center to which goods are brought for import and export and for collection and distribution. So Hong Kong was like the gateway between Asia and Europe, China especially. So if trade around the world collapsed, it would hurt Hong Kong, but because it was dependent on trade. It was an entrepot. But actually, because of circumstances like the Chinese Civil War in the late 40s, the communist takeover in China in 1949, the Suez Canal, for example, crisis in 56, Hong Kong had to evolve into an industrial economy as well, not just an entrepot. So it adapted. One of the reasons it became competitive industrially is that it had cheap labor. And the reason why it had cheap labor, it had a lot of refugees coming from China after the communist takeover. So Hong Kong is adapted, and it wasn't government that was trying to steer things. It was less government that allowed free market enterprise to evolve. So we're going to go over this book a little bit today. I've marked, as you can see here, a few interesting things that I read. Before I go into the book, let's look at what it says here on the jacket, book jacket, about Hong Kong. At the end of World War II, Hong Kong lived up to its description as the barren island. It had few natural resources. Its trade and infrastructure lay in tatters. Its small manufacturing base had been destroyed, and its income per capita was less than a third of that in its mother country, Britain. Don't forget, Hong Kong was a colony of Britain until 1997. As a British colony, it fell to a small number of civil servants to confront these difficult challenges, largely alone. But by the time of the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997, it was one of the most prosperous nations on earth. By 2015, its GDP per capita was over 40% higher than Britain's. How did that happen? So there you go. Hong Kong was occupied by the Japanese, I think, from 1941 to 1945, so about 4 years. So let's go through some of the passages here that I thought were quite interesting. Start here with the first one. And this is about taxation. That's the other thing as well. Hong Kong, the people who ran, the civil servants who ran Hong Kong in the post-war period, including Sir John Cowperthwaite, yeah, they were very enlightened, and Hong Kong was lucky because of that. John Cowperthwaite was a proponent of Adam Smith. He read about Adam Smith at university. So this is what it says here on page 80 about taxation. The contrast between a 10% tax rate with general allowances and UK policy was profound. So this was the UK in the post-war period. The standard rate of tax under Attlee, that was the post-war prime minister in Britain, was 45%, just slightly below the 50% rate applied during the war. The top rate, wait for this, was 92.5%. Perhaps equally importantly, with the erosion of allowances, the number of families paying income tax jumped from around 3.8 million before the war to 14.5 million by 1948-49 and 17.8 million by 58 and 59. Where before the war, you need to earn significantly above average earnings to pay tax, under Attlee, someone on half the average earnings became a taxpayer. So Hong Kong, the top rate, as you see, was 10%. Very little taxation. They tried to keep a hands-off policy. So how did they fund the government in Hong Kong? Well, they funded through budgeting very carefully, through being very conservative. I have to say this book is not for everyone. It's fairly easy to read, but it's a lot about budgets, about revenues and expenditures, and how they planned the budget and how they were conservative, how they wanted to build surpluses. And that's how they do it. And that's how Hong Kong became so prosperous, small government. So the other part that was interesting here on page 94 is this comment here, where Hong Kong would look to the private sector and Adam Smith for its salvation. The United Kingdom turned to government planning and Karl Marx. So I thought that was a pretty good one. We're going to look here at the budget and Keynesian deficit spending and what Hong Kong did. So it says, after the immediate post-war recovery period follows, while he was the financial secretary, like the treasury secretary for Hong Kong, had underlined the need to balance the books, indeed, to run a surplus. Where Keynesian deficits prevailed elsewhere, follows increased the bar as to how big a surplus and reserve he targeted. First, he set the objective of meeting recurrent expenditure, then to meeting recurrent and capital expenditure, then to doing that and paying down recovery loans, then to building a reserve. And by the end of this period in office, he argued that it was a requirement to hold a year's worth of revenue as reserve. So they wanted to build surpluses throughout the years to build 1 year of reserves. So if you had a problem 1 year, you wouldn't have to borrow or to tax people. So that's how Hong Kong ran. So here's another interesting part of the book, and it's to do with free trade, free markets. And it says on page 106, and they're talking about the 1954 budget. It says, while Cowperthwaite was away, the normal budget cycle continued. At the Legislative Council of 3rd of March 1954, the governor reiterated the government's commitment to free trade, even going so far as to say, and this I quote, Governor Grantham was his name, if it were not for our obligations to the United Nations, the sterling area, and the International Monetary Fund, we should not have any trade controls at all. So even the governor of Hong Kong thought that free trade was the only way forward. And the only reason they had controls was because of the United Nations, IMF. So there you go. And this is also to do with free market and small government. They talk here about imperial preference. So what was imperial preference? It says imperial preference was a system of reciprocal trade agreements between the parts of the British Empire, and later as Commonwealth preference between members of the Commonwealth. Being a member allowed Hong Kong to export goods to the United Kingdom and to other member countries free of tariffs. So there was a free market trade or free trade going on amongst the parts of the British Empire, and this was called imperial preference. You might be asking right now, what about public services for things like sanitation and water, roads, Oh yeah, Hong Kong did that too, but it did that with the surpluses, and it did the policy in Hong Kong, post-war policy, was that if the private sector could do it, they'd let the private sector do it. But if the private sector couldn't cope with it, they were prepared to fund. The government was prepared to fund, of course, through taxation, through surpluses, and they even had to fund housing, because Hong Kong had a big problem with housing, with all the refugees coming from China after the 1950 period. So yes, and they also funded education. So those people who say, oh, but government has to have a function. Yes, they do, but it has to be minimal, and it has to be something that the market and the private sector can't fund, right? So let's continue anyway. Let's go to page 111. This is what Financial Secretary Clark said. If we look after the colony's economy, revenue will look after itself, provided our tax collecting methods are efficient. If we can do something constructive to help the colony's economy, we shall automatically increase our revenue. Any considerable increase, I say deliberately considerable increase, in the rate of direct taxation at a time when the economy is strained might well in the end bring about a reduction of revenue rather than an increase. So he's basically saying here, you're not going to punish the economy when it's not doing well with even more taxation until we are reasonably sure that our economy is on a sound basis. Our proper course seems to be to limit our non-productive expenditure as far as possible, but not to hesitate to draw on our reserves for sound economic projects if we have to do so. This is a part where Governor Grantham gives his farewell address in 1958. So this is what Grantham said about Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong. The answer to that is the people of Hong Kong. What is their particular genius? Is it not their industry, their intelligence, and their ingenuity? I think it is, and besides this, they are realists. They get on with the job. There is an absence of humbug about them, and they are imbued with the spirit of cooperation. Furthermore, it has always been a tradition of Hong Kong to let the genius of its people work to their own advantage, and hence to the advantage of the community generally, without their initiative being frustrated by an excess of state planning. There you go. So what about democracy in Hong Kong? Yeah, nowadays we hear a lot about democracy. We need to save democracy. So this is what the book says here. Grantham also tried to deal with the very difficult conundrum of the lack of democracy in Hong Kong, an issue that would reverberate until the end of British rule and beyond, to the current day. Returning to the observation of the realism shown by the people of Hong Kong, he observed that, and so this is Grantham's words on the subject of democracy. They are not taken in by catchwords such as democracy. These are the people of Hong Kong. Not that democracy is not a very fine thing. It is. But many people use it as a catchword and make a mistake of regarding it as an end in itself, whereas it is only one of the means to an end, that end being individual freedom and liberty. And here in Hong Kong, despite the fact that the constitution of this council and of the Executive Council is not democratic, I venture to say that Hong Kong is one of the most live and let live places in the world. Liberty and freedom are actualities. So I'm going to end with this passage from page 125 about the role of government. So it says here, talking about an official, it says, Black was clear that to develop industry, the government's key role was to create an environment in which industry could succeed. Government's most important duty is to create a favorable climate in which both trade and industry can develop. But all of us must be aware of complacency. It is true that there are as few restrictions as possible, taxes are low, and we endeavor to keep government interference to a minimum. So there you go. I'll stop at that right now. I will come back to this book. I haven't finished it, of course. Hong Kong, as you saw, became wealthier than Britain, much wealthier than Britain per capita by 2015. You might argue, well, Hong Kong is a city-state, it's small, it can do that. Well, it could have chosen the Keynesian path and it didn't. And just because it's small doesn't mean to say that you can't put that to the test in a bigger country, I would say. So yeah, there's an example of small government, laissez-faire, low taxation, frugal governments. I think looking through the budgets here, up until the early 60s, I think there was only 1 year in the post-war period where they had a deficit. But as I said, the policy of Hong Kong was to have enough surplus to be able to run the government for 1 year. And the way they ran surpluses is that they kept government spending to a minimum. Government did help, as I said, with education, housing, sanitation, building roads, airports. But those are capital expenditures, and they made sure that they left the free market, the private sector, to do its job, to create the wealth. They didn't buy into the philosophy that government creates wealth. And Hong Kong was lucky in that sense, because it wasn't only John Cowperthwaite that was of this philosophy of free market, Adam Smith or the Austrian school, but also his predecessors, also the governors of Hong Kong, Grantham. John Cowperthwaite became eventually financial secretary. I think it was from 61 to 71. Before that, in the 50s, he was like second in command behind the financial secretary. So very interesting book. It is a little bit academic. It's not like a fun book, so to speak. It's more dry. It talks a lot about budgets and things like that. But for those people who want to know more about economics, who want to see an example of where laissez-faire and free markets worked in lieu of Keynesian and central planning, this is a good book to read. And Hong Kong went completely against the grain in the post-war world, especially compared to the mother country, Britain. Britain went the way of Marx, and Hong Kong went the way of Adam Smith and the Austrian school. And look what Hong Kong did in terms of prosperity compared to Britain. So there you go. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. Think about subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet. And I wish you all a great start to the week. Take care. Bye.